Okay, good evening, everybody. Good Chodesh. Tonight's class is sponsored by Mrs. Sarah Carmelli in honor of a new great grandson that was born today, I believe. So Mazel Tov, and you should only have simchas and
Thank you.
So she's
Amen.
class tonight. Okay, we're middle. It's Wednesday night, so it's Halacha and Tanya. We're middle of learning of Muktzeh, which means things that Chachamim forbade to move on Shabbos for the various different reasons that we learned. So 2 weeks ago, we're learning about Kli SheMelachto LeIsser, which means a vessel whose primary use is for something forbidden on Shabbos. Like, for instance, a pen, a hammer, things like that you're not allowed to use on Shabbos. Those things are allowed to be moved if you need the place it's on, or if you want to do something permissible with that object. Then we started getting into what's called Kli SheMelachto LeIsser, something which is not Muktzeh, because the primary role of that utensil is permissible things. So basically we were talking like watches are not Muktzeh, because games that you're not to that you're allowed to play. Tricycles, we learned, they're not Muktzeh. Then we started getting into the games a little bit. And we're discussing the Scrabble has two problems with it. Number one, Scrabble is a game that you normally keep score. Anything that you normally keep score, you're not allowed to play with on Shabbos, because we're afraid you'll forget it Shabbos and you'll write down to keep score. So because you're not allowed to play with it on Shabbos, it's called Kli SheMelachto LeIsser. In addition, if it's the deluxe Scrabble where you're actually firmly putting the pieces into the grooves, so then it's even worse, because then you're also writing. Jigsaw puzzles we were discussing, you're not allowed to make on Shabbos because that you're creating a shape. It's like writing. So therefore, a jigsaw puzzle is Muktzeh. Now, balls is where we just got up to. There's an argument in halacha if a ball is Muktzeh on Shabbos. We discussed this last time. We said that the Vaad Rebbe is lenient, and he says the minhag in the world is that a ball is not considered Muktzeh, because you're allowed to play ball, obviously only in a place where you're allowed to carry. Now, what happens though? Therefore, for instance, baseball bats, gloves, mitts, all that is not Muktzeh, tennis balls, tennis rackets, racquetball rackets, because technically all these games you're allowed to play on Shabbos. So therefore, the game is not Muktzeh. Now, what happens if you have something like whistles, musical toys, pull toys, you pull it and then it makes noise, or talking dolls. So the thing is like this. A whistle, because you're not allowed to whistle on Shabbos, you're not allowed to use a whistle on Shabbos. Whistling with your mouth is permissible on Shabbos. But whistling with an instrument, with a whistle, is not allowed on Shabbos. So if you can't whistle on Shabbos, it's Muktzeh. But what about you have a toy? Now, let me preface this with another din. You're not allowed to wind up any toy on Shabbos. The same thing with a watch. Years ago, when you wound up watches and your watch stopped on Shabbos, you wouldn't be allowed to wind it up on Shabbos. Why would you not be allowed to wind it up on Shabbos? Because you're fixing something that was broken. Basically, it wasn't working, and now you're working. So let's say you have a wind-up doll, a wind-up toy that kids play with. So you're not allowed to wind it up on Shabbos. Nevertheless, it's not Muktzeh. Why isn't it Muktzeh? Because you can play with it without winding it up. It's a doll. It's a game. It's a toy. So you're not allowed to wind it up. But nevertheless, the toy is not, you have to be careful not to wind it. But the toy is not going to be Muktzeh because you're allowed to play with the toy as is. So that wouldn't be Muktzeh. You have to be very careful. Anything that's a noisemaker on Shabbos is forbidden. Take, for instance, little kids, they play with rattles. So a little kid takes a rattle and plays with it, it's not an issue. But an adult is not allowed to play with a rattle, use a rattle on Shabbos. Let's say a kid is screaming and you want to rattle the rattle to calm the kid down. On Shabbos, you would not be allowed to do that because you're making noise. It's a noisemaker. you're not allowed to make noise in Shabbos. So then you couldn't move the rattle. Okay. Now, technically, some poskim write that because the kid, if they take it themselves, would be allowed to play with it, so then it's not muktzeh. But the truth is, you should really refrain from actually moving a rattle on Shabbos. Number one, you're going to come forget and rattle it because that's what normally you do. So you shouldn't be really touching or moving a rattle, moving a rattle on Shabbos. Arts and craft supplies. Somebody just adds something. What about a grogger? The same thing. A grogger is an instrument that makes noise. So you can't, grogger would be muktzeh on Shabbos. Now, arts and craft supplies, let's say, the construction paper or pens or markers or glue or finger paints, all that stuff. All that stuff you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So because you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos, it is completely muktzeh. I mean, not completely. It's Kli SheMelachto LeIsser. You can only move it if you need the place or you want to use it for something permissible. I don't remember if I mentioned it. I probably did. For instance, a telephone book. As we said, Oliver Shalom, the telephone books, you're not allowed to use it to look up a number because a phone number, you can't use a phone on Shabbos. But if somebody wants to use it to boost a kid up, or they want to look up an address to go to a friend's house that we mentioned last time, you'd be allowed to do it. Again, then you're moving it, let's say, to Gufa. Or if you need the place where it is, you'd be allowed to move it. All these things like uniforms, like baseball uniforms, because you're allowed to play baseball on Shabbos and it's a uniform, it's clothing, so those would not be muktzeh at all on Shabbos. Now, let's say you have chess, checkers, Monopoly, other board games. So we started talking about this last time. Bottom line is, if you're not allowed to play the game on Shabbos, it's muktzeh. Checkers, you're allowed to play. Chess, you're allowed to play. Backgammon, you're allowed to play. Monopoly, there are opinions that hold you could, but you really shouldn't. So you shouldn't play with all these games on Shabbos. So therefore, they would be considered more or less muktzeh. Now, what happens if somebody has binoculars, microscope, telescopes? I'm not talking about electric ones. Obviously, those for sure you can't use on Shabbos. If you have just a telescope, there's just a bunch of mirrors or binoculars or microscope, as long as it's not electric, they're not muktzeh. You're allowed to use a telescope. On Shabbos, you're allowed to look to the sky in a telescope. It's not a problem. So therefore, they're not muktzeh at all. Marbles, the kids used to play with. Pre-marbles, in the time of the Gemara, it's interesting, the kids would play with little round nuts, hazelnuts, because they didn't have all these things. And that's what they had. They would play with hazelnuts, what we call marbles. So marbles, you're allowed to play with on Shabbos. The only question is if you're allowed to play with marbles on a floor, and that's carpeted floor, or even on a tile floor. According to the Alter Rebbe, it comes out you're not allowed to play with them on Shabbos. Others might permit it. But anyway, kids can play with marbles on the table. They shouldn't play with marbles on the floor. The reason is because you might make holes in the ground, even though it's tiled and it's carpeted. But we're afraid if you do it there, you're going to do it on a earthenware floor and you play marbles, you're going to make holes in the ground, which is an offshoot of the malacha of plowing. Now, brooms. Okay. Now there's a new style brooms and the old style brooms. Any broom, years ago, the straw of the broom would actually come out. So those brooms you're not allowed to use on Shabbos, even inside the house, because we're afraid it might come out and then you'll put it back in, so you're fixing the broom. But today's brooms, like nylon, it's most brooms today are like nylon or synthetic. So you're allowed to use it only on tiled floors, linoleum floors. You cannot sweep a carpet on Shabbos with a broom. Definitely not with the carpet sweeper that's manual. But you're not allowed to sweep carpet on Shabbos because you're actually going to be, it's a material that you might be cleaning. In other words, you're not allowed to clean material on Shabbos. It's one of the lamites malachos, okay? It's called malabin, you're cleaning the garment. Now, when you have a carpet, so, if there's lint only and the broom takes it off, that's not the problem. But sometimes you can have dirt or whatever it may be stuck to the carpet. And then when you take the broom and you clean it off, you're actually cleaning the carpet. That's why a manual carpet sweeper, they have these manual carpet sweepers. You're not allowed to use it on Shabbos because, again, you might clean the floor. If you're talking about a tiled floor or a linoleum floor or whatever type of floor those are, then you're allowed to sweep them on Shabbos with a broom that the bristles don't come off. Why would you be allowed to do that? Because a tile floor you're allowed to clean. It doesn't absorb. A carpet is material, so it absorbs. When you take off dirt, then you're actually cleaning it. Tile and linoleum and those types of things, they don't absorb the material. It's only on top. So therefore, you're not cleaning the tile, you're just removing the dirt from it. And then that wouldn't be a problem. So bottom line about brooms, the halacha of brooms is that if it's a carpet, you're not allowed to sweep it on Shabbos. But the broom itself is not muktzeh, because you could sweep a tile floor. You definitely cannot sweep outside dirt. That's for sure forbidden. Then you're mamish making holes in the ground also, which is a bigger problem than anything else. But because you would be allowed to sweep a house with that type of broom, it's usable on Shabbos. So the broom itself is not muktzeh.
Torch, it's not earth.
If it's wood, you'd be allowed to sweep it. Stone you could sweep, but you can't do it on if it's dirt or carpeted or a rug or whatever. Okay, now aerosol sprays on Shabbos. Now, sometimes you can have spray paint, okay, a can of spray paint. Now, obviously, you can't spray paint on Shabbos. That's coloring, painting. So therefore, that can would be Kli SheMelachto LeIsser. So you couldn't move it unless if you needed a place or you want to use it for something permissible. But there's certain aerosol cans that you're allowed to, the thing that you're doing is permissible on Shabbos. Therefore, the aerosol can is not muktzeh. For instance, and I want to preface this with another argument which is relevant to this din. According to all opinions, it's forbidden to create a smell on garments. It's something called meiludrecha. You are creating a smell. If you take perfume or cologne or anything that smells good, and you put it on a piece of clothing or material, everybody holds that's forbidden on Shabbos. Okay, completely forbidden on Shabbos. What about if you put it on your body or you spray it into the air? So that is an argument in halacha. Many people permit it. In fact, most people permit it. The Alter Rebbe says in Hilchos Yom Tov that is preferable not to do it. But again, even the big Lubavitch Rabbonim of the previous generations would say that you could do it, but the Alter Rebbe says it's better to refrain from it. But there's a difference, and this is very important in Hilchos Shabbos. There's a difference if you're doing it to create a good smell, or you're doing it to remove a foul smell, a bad smell, a bad odor. For instance, in the bathroom, if you want to spray to remove a foul odor in the bathroom, everybody says you'd be allowed to do it because you're not doing it to create a smell in the room. you're doing it to remove a foul odor. That would be allowed. But if you just want to go into a room, guests are coming, whatever, you want to spray Febreze in the room just to make the room smell better. Again, many opinions say you're allowed to. The Alter Rebbe said it would be better to refrain from doing it. But if you're doing it to remove a foul smell, then you're allowed to do it. So let's come back to the, for instance, underarm deodorant sprays. Now, most people do it not to create a good smell, for that to put on cologne. People use, generally speaking, spray deodorants to be able to, this shouldn't have a foul smell eventually. You're not doing it to create a good smell. Now, what's very important to understand is stick deodorant is forbidden to use on Shabbos. It's the malacha of what's called memachek. It's smoothing a surface. Remember, we learned you can't use toothpaste, you can't use cream, you can't use anything that's solid, that you're going to be rubbing it against something, because you're smoothing a hard surface. So, for instance, if somebody has deodorant that's stick deodorant, that you're not allowed to use on Shabbos. If that's the case, then it's Muktzeh. That stick deodorant is Muktzeh. But if somebody wants to put on powder, somebody wants to use spray deodorant or roll-on deodorant, which is basically liquid coming out through that container, so then, again, you'd be allowed to do it, even, okay, why is it okay to smell Havdalah? First of all, you're allowed to smell things on Shabbos. You're not spraying it to make a good. And secondly, Havdalah is after Shabbos already. Anyway, but the point is that if it's spray deodorant, then you're allowed to put it on Shabbos, so therefore it wouldn't be Muktzeh at all. If it's something you're not allowed to use on Shabbos, for instance, spray pesticide. Let's say you have a bunch of ants in the house running around. You're not allowed to spray them on Shabbos to kill them, because then you're killing a bug. You're not allowed to do it. You can spray bug repellent on Shabbos. If you go outside and there's a lot of, especially in the countries and the camps, where there's a lot of mosquitoes, and you want to spray your hand or any part of your body that the mosquitoes should be repelled, that you're allowed to, because you're not doing it to kill them. It doesn't kill them anyway, it just keeps them away. So that aerosol can is not Muktzeh, because you would be allowed to use pressed repellent on Shabbos. To use a can that kills bugs on Shabbos, you're not allowed to use. So therefore that Kli becomes Kli SheMelachto LeIsser. So again, you can have two deodorants. One is Muktzeh, one isn't. If it's stick deodorant, it's Muktzeh. If it's not stick deodorant, it's not Muktzeh. What's the difference? This you're allowed to use. So it's not Muktzeh. You're not allowed to use it. It is Muktzeh. Again, mouthwash sprays, perfume sprays, again, it's the same thing. Using perfume on Shabbos or Yom Tov. If somebody, the same thing as Shabbos and Yom Tov. If somebody holds that you're allowed to use perfume on Shabbos because you're not putting it on your body. I'm sorry, you're not putting it on your clothing. You're only putting it on your body. So then it would be allowed according to most opinions. Alter Rebbe again says it's better to refrain from using it. But then it's not Muktzeh. Hairsprays are a big problem. You can definitely not spray a sheitel on Shabbos or Yom Tif. That's for sure not, because of baina, whatever, you're constructing something. But that's a separate issue. Okay. Now, artificial plants. Okay, things that don't grow are not Muktzeh on Shabbos. Silk flowers, dried plant arrangements, fake trees, centerpieces. they are not Muktzeh on Shabbos. A live plant is Muktzeh on Shabbos. Not cut flowers. Cut flowers are not Muktzeh on Shabbos. If you have somebody brings you flowers on Shabbos, you can't put it into water on Shabbos, but you can just put it in an empty vase. But you wouldn't be allowed to put it into water.
You can touch it.
You can move it. But cut flowers are not Muktzeh. But a live plant, a lot of times people bring you a plant because it's still growing and it's in earth, that's completely Muktzeh on Shabbos. Can't move it for any reason. It's completely Muktzeh on Shabbos. Okay, now another case over here is like this. Safety pins are allowed to be used on Shabbos. Therefore, they're not Muktzeh. Now, to what extent can a safety pin be used on Shabbos? So many opinions say if you put it in and out on the same side, you stick it in, stick it out on the same side. Some people say you're not allowed to use it on Shabbos. Other poskim say you could use it on Shabbos. The way it seems to be that we are lenient on this, using it on Shabbos. But a safety pin, anyway, if you stick it in one side and the other side, not in the same side, in and out. You just stick it into one side and in the other side, everybody says you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos. Therefore, safety pins are not considered Muktzeh on Shabbos at all.
Sounds like the same thing.
What?
That came up with the same thing.
Okay, Magnus we discussed. Okay, a Shabbos blach. This is an interesting din. The blach, that the piece of metal that you cover your fires with, is not Muktzeh on Shabbos. Therefore, halachically, interestingly, if let's say somebody forgot, Shabbos began, and they forgot to put a blach on Shabbos. Before Shabbos, they forgot to put the blach on. So you have to be careful, but halachically, you're allowed to put a blech over a fire on Shabbos. You have to make sure not to extinguish the fire. If you extinguish the fire, then you're doing another aveda. But a blech itself is allowed to be moved. Because you have a blech on the stove and you want to move it around, it's not muktzeh at all, because the blech is not doing anything forbidden. It's not Kli SheMelachto LeIsser. Okay, we're going to start today another category of muktzeh, which is completely muktzeh, meaning you're not allowed to move it for any reason whatsoever. Obviously, if somebody's life is in danger, you can move it.
You just gave the example of a live plant. Totally
Muktzeh,
Why?
because you're not allowed to move things that grow on Shabbos. It's not a keli. Okay, now, there's another muktzeh called, we mentioned it in passing, but now we're going to learn the din. There's something called muktzeh machmas chsorin kis, which means it's loss, it's muktzeh, because you're going to withhold it, muktzeh, you're going to withhold it because of fear of monetary loss. Okay? Now, what it means is like this. We're talking about things that normally wouldn't be muktzeh, but their only main usage, and when I give you examples, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. When you have something that's primary use is for something forbidden on Shabbos. So seemingly it should be Kli SheMelachto LeIsser, which you would be allowed to move if you need the place, if there's something permissible with it. But if it's something that you wouldn't use, but for the purpose it's made for, then it's completely muktzeh. To give you a few examples of this, and then we'll go into the details of this. A shaychet's knife is made primarily, it's a knife, okay? You're not going to cut a steak with it, and you're not going to cut a kugel with it. A shaychet's knife is a very delicate knife. It's an expensive knife. It takes a long process to make it a proper, knife for shechita. And you're not going to use it for anything but shchita, and shchita is forbidden on Shabbos. So therefore, a sheichit's knife, even though it's a knife, and okay, shchita, it's something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. But here it's worse than that, because nobody's going to use a sheichit's knife for anything but shchita. The same thing, a moil's knife. Nobody's going to cut a piece of cake with a moil's knife. So it's never going to have anything permissible. So therefore, the fact that it's only made, now bris milah normally is forbidden on Shabbos. The only time a bris is allowed to be made on Shabbos if it's a natural birth and it's the 8th day. But if a bris is pushed off, you're not allowed to do a bris on Shabbos. If it's the 8th day and a natural delivery, then the Torah says you have to do a bris that day. But otherwise, technically, bris milah is forbidden to do on Shabbos. A moil's knife, therefore, is designated for something which is used for something forbidden. And you're not going to use it for anything else. Therefore, a sheichit's knife, a moil's knife, is something which is completely awesome. You can't move it for any reason whatsoever. Another example of this, but again, who defines this? If something is Kli SheMelachto LeIsser, I mean, Muktzeh or not, it's the individual owner. And I'll give you an example as we go on. It's getting late already, but as we go on, I'll give you an example. Anything you bought in the store that you're planning to return, doesn't matter what it is. It's not even a question of how expensive it is. If you bought something in the store and you're planning to return it, even a garment. If you're planning to return it, that garment is muktzeh. Why? You're not going to use it for anything because you ruin it, you won't be able to give it back. I'm not talking about Costco that takes things back after 100 years of using it. But normal stores, if it's a little bit messed up, they're not going to take it back. So therefore, if you buy merchandise, except food is never muktzeh. But if you are planning to return something, it's completely muktzeh on Shabbos, even if it's clothing. Okay. Okay. Now, even by the way, a guy that sells, let's say he has a store in his house. He sells things in his house. And he has goods that he normally sells. He's not allowed to use it for any purpose on Shabbos. Why? He's not going to use it because he wants to sell it. If he breaks it or ruins it and nicks it, it's not going to be usable on Shabbos. So therefore, that would be completely muktzeh. He wouldn't be allowed to use it. Anything, okay, to be continued next week, there's a lot of categories. One simple example is, we mentioned this when we mentioned it last time, a little flute, a recorder that the kids play is a Kli SheMelachto LeIsser. Okay, it's no big deal. You're going to use it for anything. But an expensive violin, expensive flute that costs hundreds and thousands of dollars, you're not going to hit somebody with it, or you're not going to do something with it. So therefore, that would also be classified as muktzeh, machnas, and kiss, and then it would be completely muktzeh.